class. So my name is Rainville, and today I'm going to present to you my essay based on media bias and climate advocacy. I'm going to talk about biased reporting and how it affects the way the public understands climate change, and why the bias makes meaningful climate action harder to achieve. I'll be inserting my slides right here for you to see, and I have my notes right here on my computer, so I'll be reading off of my notes, and I hope you enjoy. I did a lot of research on this essay, and it's a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, so enjoy. So on my second slide, I have the purpose, and the purpose of my essay or project is to show how media bias weakens climate advocacy, as many news outlets frame environmental efforts as political or inconvenient, which causes confusion, mistrust, and delayed action. Accurate reporting is essential for the public to understand the seriousness of the climate issues. In my third slide, I have my agenda, and this is what I'll go over. First, I'll explain media bias in general. Then I'll look at the political and economical pressures of the news industry and how they shape climate stories. Next, I'll show you how this affects public understanding, including loyalty to the public, social media influence, and the real-world consequences. I will also cover the counter-argument and then explain my conclusion before ending with my works cited. The next slide I have here is my media bias overview, and many outlets downplay the climate science or frame climate advocacy as political. This happens when stories focus more on conflict or controversy instead of scientific facts. These patterns hurt the credibility and funding of advocacy groups and make climate solutions seem less urgent. In my next slide, I'll talk about political and economic pressures, as it's a big reason for biased coverage and pressure from advertisers, especially fossil fuel companies. News outlets rely on these advertisers for revenue, so they can avoid reporting that threatens business interests. Political divides across news outlets make this worse. Some outlets intentionally frame climate advocacy as extreme or unnecessary, which confuses audiences and weakens trust in experts. My next slide here is about the misrepresentation of climate science. Another issue is the way climate science is represented. Some news outlets exaggerate uncertainty or make it sound like scientists disagree when they actually do not. Important topics like health risks are also left out of coverage. This creates an incomplete picture of the climate crisis and weakens the public understanding. And then, obviously, in class we read elements of journalism. So here, my next slide is about the loyalty to the public. Journalists are supposed to remain loyal to the public, but many outlets prioritize politics or profit instead. When loyalty to the audience is lost, trust disappears. As a result, people doubt climate research and advocacy groups lose support. Media bias makes it harder for journalists to fulfill their responsibility to provide clear, accurate information. This brings me to my next slide, which is about honest and independent reporting. Honest and independent reporting is essential, but lobbying and financial influence often shape which stories are told. Some outlets highlight the cost of climate policies while ignoring their environmental or social benefits. When reporting is influenced by business or political interests, it delays action and leaves audiences unsure of what to believe. And then in my next slide, I talk about underreported health and social risks, which is something that I think gets very overlooked, but it's something that I found in my research, and honestly, I didn't really think about this too deeply until my research, but it's another problem in the lack of coverage on the health and social impacts of climate change, as evidence shows that climate change increases risks like respiratory issues, heat stress, and financial instability. But these topics rarely appear in mainstream reporting. Without the transparency and verification in journalism, the public does not get a full understanding of what's at stake. The next slide I have here is on the social media influence, and obviously this is something we all know and we all experience. And so I'm going to talk about how social media affects climate advocacy, because social media spreads climate misinformation even faster. False or misleading content circulates quickly, and traditional news outlets sometimes repeat online claims without checking them. Algorithms on social media platforms often prioritize emotional content over facts, which makes people more skeptical of science and weakens climate advocacy even more. I think this is like something we can all agree on, not just with the topic of climate. The next slide that I have here is on the real-world consequences of inaccurate reporting on climate advocacy, because these patterns do have real consequences for how people view climate disasters. When the media focuses more on political debate, people forget that the effects are already happening in the form of floods, fires, or extreme heat, which many of you might argue that right now climate change isn't a thing because it's so cold outside. But that's a whole other conversation. When coverage makes these events feel distant, people are less motivated to support policy solutions and take personal action. And this leads me to my next slide, which is my counter argument, as some might argue that media is not a serious issue. Media bias is not a serious issue because people know bias exists and can check multiple sources. They claim that bias forces journalists to be more transparent and pushes audiences to think critically. This is true, but from this perspective, bias is threatened as something that encourages research instead of blocking it. And my response to that counter argument is that even though people know bias exists, it still has strong influence. Most audiences rely on news sources that match their political beliefs, so they are more likely to trust biased information. False balance in reporting also makes it seem like climate scientists are divided, even though they are not. Because most people do not have time to verify every claim that they are seeing, biased coverage still shapes what they believe and slows the climate action. And this brings me to my last slide before my work cited, which is my conclusion. So, in conclusion, media bias plays a major role in shaping how the public understands climate change. Although some believe bias encourages more research, it still causes confusion, misinformation, and delayed action. News outlets prioritize politics and profit over facts. Advocacy groups lose support, and solutions are pushed back because of this. Accurate reporting and loyalty to the public are essential for meaningful climate action. And here's my work cited, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation, and I hope you maybe learned something new.